Okay, I have chat. Apparently, you have to explicitly mark your stream as not for children. I figured it's for anyone, whatever. I'm not gonna be cussing or anything, but now I know. So I just shared the link. I'm gonna give it a second. I'm gonna pull up the chat on my phone. Okay. Goodness gracious. If you can hear me, I see the green dots on my screen here, but just to validate if you can hear me and you have access to the chat, if you could confirm that audio quality is good and video quality is good. Hey, Seth, can you hear me now? All right, cool. Let's share my screen. I'm just going to share the whole screen. Not that. Okay. Let's just jump right into it. I haven't really done much. I just got my editor set up. I scaffolded up this Rails application. Haven't even committed the initial commit yet. Pretty simple. I basically scaffold all of my demo apps, even production apps at work this way. So I'm calling this OAuth demo. I like to run on Rails main. We're going to use SQLite for the database, of course. Propshaft, ESBuild, Tailwind. Not going to need JBuilder, Action Mailbox, Action Mailer, or Spring. So drop all of those out. Let's go ahead and commit our initial commit. And that gets all of that there. So what are we doing? I wanted to do another series of live streams digging into a topic that I've been exploring off and on for a while now. And I feel like I have enough of a grasp of what's going on that I can get to it. What is Propshaft? Propshaft is the alternative to Sprockets for handling assets in Rails applications. So it's going to be the new default in Rails 8. It is the current default as of, I don't know, maybe 3 days ago for Rails main. And the basic idea is that instead of Sprockets sort of having all of this Ruby code built in to do minification, to do transpilation of SAS, transpilation of CoffeeScript, all of these different things, like all of that gets pushed to these front-end tools. So if you want to run TypeScript and you want to have TypeScript transpiled to JavaScript, if you want to use something like ESBuild to do your JavaScript bundling, if you want to use something like Tailwind to do your CSS transpilation / bundling, you can use those tools and plug them in with Propshaft. And really, Propshaft, the core of what it's doing is just doing asset fingerprinting for you, setting up the helpers as we are used to in our application layout. But it delegates all of the bundling, compilation, transpilation, all those things to whatever third-party tools you want to use, and just sort of sets up a series of conventions for where they need to put files, how they need to name them. So it's just simpler, leaner, better adapted, and more pluggable for the modern front end world. I really enjoy using it. So back to OAuth. I had this experience maybe, I guess at this point, almost 2 years ago now, the very first time I recall um, seeing an error in our error monitoring service that something with our OmniAuth setup wasn't working. Users weren't able to sign in through the SSO providers that we had configured for this application. And so, time to go fix a bug. And the amount of time that it took me to figure out just what precisely was broken was mind-bogglingly frustrating. I could not get clear error messages from OmniAuth. And as I started to dig in to figure out like why, it's like, well, it's doing everything through rack middleware, and it's pretty tightly integrated with Warden. So you don't even, Rails doesn't even see it, right? It happens at the rack layer. And so then I start trying to dig in, start reading source code, like, okay, what are you doing? What's going on here? How can I hook in there to just see something, emit something, get a sense of where the problem might be? I had to open, I think it was 3, maybe even 4 different gems. Like, so if you're using Google, you have like the OmniAuth Google gem, and that gem is sitting on top of the OmniAuth OAuth 2 gem, and that gem is sitting on top of the OmniAuth gem. And so you have like these 3 different layers of abstraction. All of them, of course, are using the OmniAuth DSL. So you already have the abstraction of not really knowing precisely like what HTTP calls are being made to what endpoints with what query parameters, what responses are coming in, what is the body of those responses, what's the HTTP verb of those responses. Right? Like even just trying to get some of this information was really difficult. And then, of course, when you have 3 different gems, like I had these 3 different GitHub tabs open, I'm jumping between these files in GitHub, trying to just piece together like what is the actual execution flow of this code, and how can I inject something in there to just see like what is happening. Is there something that has changed in the payload from a response that we're not expecting? Is there's something wrong with the payload that we are sending and we're getting an error message, and like what's the error message that we're getting back? Like just any of these things, really struggling. And that sent me on a journey to start really understanding like what actually is OAuth, specifically OAuth 2. How does it work? And do I need OmniAuth in order to set up these kinds of integrations? And as I've built different apps at work and on the side, I have taken each opportunity where I needed an OAuth integration to like dig in a little bit more and get a sense. And now I think I have enough of an understanding of what's going on that I wanted to get it all organized and put together and sort of do this series for my sake, as well as anyone who watches it. Like, what is actually happening here? And also, hopefully, to start moving the Rails ecosystem away from OmniAuth. Because it's useful when everything goes well, but the indirection and the abstraction really comes at a cost whenever something goes wrong. And I think it's important for us to start really thinking about when we're building the software, are we building it in a way that we can respond quickly, comfortably, confidently when something goes wrong? And in my opinion, OmniAuth is a bit long in the tooth, and modern, resilient, error-tolerant Rails applications might be better off to use something else. And as developers, if we're going to be responsible for fixing problems that happen with these integrations, and they are essential integrations, and they've become, I think, for many applications, essential integrations. There are a fair number of applications where it's the only way that you authenticate. Right? There is no email password. You either authenticate with your Google account, your Facebook account, your GitHub account, your Twitter account, what have you. Right? And so if users can't sign in, if users can't sign up, that is a critical problem for your application. And so especially for these kinds of issues, critical integrations, it's really important that we have a rock solid understanding of what is happening, how the code is running, such that if and when something does go wrong, we can fix it in a timely manner. We can fix it confidently, and we can fix it comfortably, right? Like, we're not overly stressed. We're not sitting there reading 4 different GitHub tabs, trying to make sense of this DSL abstraction over this HTTP handshake flow to just see like what is even the error in these Warden middlewares, to then go in and start making the appropriate fix. Right? So that's all of the context. That's what leads me to starting this series. And let's jump into it. So I thought a useful place to start is to get us all on the same page around like, what is OAuth, specifically OAuth 2? How does it work? Right? I imagine that everyone here has some basic familiarity with it because it's so pervasive in web application development today. The core idea is that you delegate. So I'm building some new application. I delegate, oftentimes, authentication to a third-party provider. And I do that because I want, as the application, I want access to be able to read or write users' data that lives in that third-party provider. So you can use it exclusively for authentication if you want, but typically you use it for authentication plus authorization. I want to authorize my application to take action on this user's GitHub data, for example, on their behalf. So how does this flow work? So a user comes to your application and you have some button, right? You want to sign in with Facebook or connect your Facebook account, whatever the wording is, however you sort of conceive of that flow in your application. When they click that button, they get redirected to the external login page. So in this case, it's Facebook's login page. So we redirect them from myapp.com to facebook.com. The user then logs in to facebook.com with their Facebook credentials. If you are asking for permission to read and write some of their Facebook data for the first time, then the next screen that facebook.com is going to show them is an access authorization screen. Hey, my application wants to read your email address. Do you give them permission? Yes or no? They click yes. Then facebook.com redirects them back to your application. And when they send them back to your application, they include an authorization code. So they say, they have granted you permission for what you asked for, and here's the code. Now, this code you need to convert into an actual access token. So you take that code and you send it to the provider. In this case, we're using the example of Facebook. You send it to their authorization service. You say, hi, Facebook, I have this authorization code, and I would like the corresponding access code. So you send that to them, they send a response, here's the access code. And with this access code, you can use that now when talking to the Facebook API to authenticate those API requests. And those API requests now, Facebook, when they receive them, knows these API requests are being authenticated by my application on behalf of this user. So that's the general flow. As I said, there's really two key elements. There's authentication and authorization, like who is this user? And then what are the actions that my application wants to be able to take on this user's behalf with this user's data in the third-party provider? So there's a number of write-ups you can read. I'm not going to sit here and read through this, how it works. It's just some of the key terms that you'll see in the jargon. And again, I don't know what it is with modern tech. Everything has to come up with new nouns to describe everything. I don't know why. So you always have to learn new jargon. In OAuth, we have this jargon, the resource owner. This is just the user. Resource owner. This is the resource owner. It's the person who is using your application. You have the client. This is you. This is your application. So relative to the OAuth scheme, you are the client. You have the authorization server. That's over here. This is the service that the third party provides, which will basically convert authorization codes into access tokens. And then you have the resource server. This is just the third party's API, right? So api.facebook.com, right? You have this concept of scopes. This is how you describe, here's what I want permission for. Access tokens, authorization codes, we've gone through that. There's a lot of extra stuff. It's a more complicated specification to cover a wider range of use cases, but we're really only interested in, for right now, the authorization code grant type. And that's what's described here. You send a user to the third party to authenticate. They authenticate, they authorize you to read and write whatever data you ask, the scopes you request. Third party returns an authorization code. You convert the authorization code into an access code. You use the access code to talk to their API. That is the authorization code grant type. Just to start things off, there is, of course, some prior art in this space. So Brad Gessler, with his no password gem, has been exploring setting up OAuth integrations independently of OmniAuth. Right now, he only has Google, but I learned a lot by really studying this code closely, seeing what he was doing. And you can do the same. We're going to end up in a very similar place, but I want to start from scratch and work our way up into it. So that's background, what we're talking about, what we're doing, why we're doing it. Let's start, I guess. Why not? So the first thing to think about is, how do we want to describe our routes? What are our routes? What are our controllers? How do we model this in our application? So I'm going to start off with what I think is the most common, simplest scenario. And that's the scenario where I want to use OAuth as a delegation mechanism for authentication. So I don't want to have to handle email and password authentication myself. This is the core idea of the no password gem, right? Do authentication without passwords. Ooh, not that tab. So I want to drive authentication purely through signing in with external providers. So how do we want to model this? What I typically do, I like to start off and keep things as RESTful as possible. So if you like study how Devise structures the world, and you sort of remove a little bit of the abstraction, you're going to see that there are two core RESTful interactions that are there. So you've got effectively resources users, and we, in this case, only need new and create. And you've got resources sessions. So you have the page that you show to users, and you have the action that the form takes on that page. So creating a new user is, well, Copilot wants to talk about signing in first. Sure. Creating a new user is signing up. Signing up is adding a new user record to your database. Signing in is, I have a user record. I want to make a new session for an existing user record. So I use this structure every time I'm setting up authentication. You can set up these aliases if you want, or you can just like use the raw RESTful routes themselves. I'm just going to keep it very lean right now and very explicit. So going to just use the RESTful actions. So we see immediately that we're going to need to scaffold these two models that can back these controllers. So we're going to need a concept of users, and we're going to need a concept of sessions. Before we get to that, though, I want to continue on like the routing sort of architecture and think about this interaction here, how this works. So user comes to our page. This is going to be the session's new route. Okay. When they click this button, what is that route? Now, I'm going to go ahead and just like say this is the case, and we'll dig into more why as we go, but you can't immediately redirect them to facebook.com. You're going to need to have that button come back to your app so you can prepare the redirection properly and then make the redirection afterwards. So this button is not going to like, be a button inside of a form that submits straight to facebook.com. We want it to come back to us, and then we're going to send a redirection response to the browser, and that's going to kick things off. This is security related. It's just much simpler. So we need a post endpoint, and then when they finish their work on the third-party provider site, so in this case, in this example, we're talking about Facebook, Facebook needs to redirect them back to a route on our application. And that needs to be a get route. So we need another pair of get and post actions, and we want to model it. The modeling that I like is also the same modeling that Brad likes. Right? It's the language of authorizations. If you read about OAuth 2, you'll often see sentences like this. OAuth 2 is an authorization protocol and not an authentication protocol. Okay, we're going to use it for authentication as well. You always, I don't know about always, but almost always you use it for authentication as well. That's a step in the process. But what we are ultimately getting back, right, is this authorization code turns into an access code. So the language of authorizations is valuable. I think it models the domain quite well. So I'm going to use like just this generic name. What I like to do is I like to put these routes under a namespace, and I use the provider name as the namespace. This is going to map to folders in our app controllers directory, and I think it helps to organize things well. So we are going to have, no, it doesn't need to be standard. We're just going to do a standard resources, authorizations. Look at that, Copilot, reading my mind here, indeed. So we're going to want a create action, right? This is the post that the button that we will show in sessions new and users new will be submitting to. And then we want a show action. This is going to be the get route that the third-party provider is going to redirect the user to when they are done with the authentication and authorization flow in that system. So this collection of routes, I think, clearly and succinctly models the domain of OAuth quite well. We have signing up for our application, signing in for our application, and we have restfully described how we are going to integrate the OAuth flow into our application flow. So I always have these routes as well. Let's start setting up the code to make these things real and usable. So let's scaffold up these models. I like to prepare things over here first. So we're going to need the views as well. So I'm going to use scaffold. Let's see. We don't need all of this. We definitely don't need that. So for our user, this is going to depend a little bit on like the third-party provider that you're working with. But you're going to want, like, typically, right, some sort of identifier for the user that you can show on the screen, like, hey, I see you. I have seen username, screen name, like all kinds of things. We'll just go with screen name. And we're going to presume that our third-party provider will return an avatar URL that we can use to display in our application as well. But for now, we don't need anything else. We don't need a password digest, that's for sure. If we know that our third-party provider will send us back an email, and we know that we're going to need to email them, we can include this as well. We can replace, like, this can be our identifier. Whatever the case, you set it up however you like. I'm just going to stick with email and avatar URL for now. It's pretty common. And I want to ensure, like, whatever you use as your identifier, it's valuable to add a uniqueness constraint at the database level for that field as well. we're going to want to make sure that it's always present, and we're going to want to make sure that it is unique, because our users table needs to have some strong guarantees about it. For our sessions, it is going to belong to a user, and then I like to store two pieces of information that will come from the request: user agent and IP address, just for a little bit of extra content and context for these different sessions. It makes it easy to set up, for example, a sessions index view that you make available to authenticated users to show them all of their sessions. And you can introspect the user agent. You can also do some introspection on the IP address if you want to show them, like, yeah, this is a session from the Safari browser on Mac OS version 12. It was created from Germany. It originated from Germany. It was created 2 days ago, so forth. And then users can really easily say, oh, I want to revoke that session. So that's why I like to store this information. It drives that kind of view really easily. So let's, this is a bit bigger. Let's scaffold these two things up. We're going to get a lot, and I'm going to start off by deleting some stuff too. So we don't need that for now. I'm just getting rid of, like, let's just get rid of everything we don't need for what we're doing. We need new. I'm going to put everything, we're not going to have an actual form, right? It's just going to be a button. I'm not going to be showing their profile anyway. I don't do system tests at the moment. Don't need a helper for the time being. Oh, there's nothing in the model. Come here, we want to say null false, and then I prefer this format for indexes. So our primary identifier must be present and must be unique. Then we can delete this because we already have the routes that we want right here. And then we can come into the controller and we can drop all of the routes that we don't need. We're not going to need that before action. We are just doing new and create. We're not setting the user. And well, actually, I say all of this, but actually, as I'm thinking about it, for our initial simple use case, we don't even need create, because we're going to redirect to, we're going to submit to the authorizations endpoint here. So we don't need any of that. For our model, I like to always ensure that I have model validations that match the constraints on the database. Views, we've only got new. Yep, perfect. And then when you have uniqueness constraints, you need to go in and make sure that your fixtures are valid. Right now it wouldn't be, because these are not unique. Let's do one with one and one without. Run the migration. to, just for the time being, delete all this so we have a cleaner commit. Well, I need to add all of this. Scaffold a user resource. Let's put that all back. And let's do the same for session. So again, we don't need a lot of this stuff. So let's drop everything we don't need. Nope. Okay, that looks good. We don't need that because we have this, and we can come into our controller and similarly drop all of this, which we don't need. Very nice. Come back into routes, delete this for the time being so we get a cleaner commit. Add it back. So very lean, very simple, but it is going to allow us to set these things up. Let's come in here, clean this up a little bit. I don't need that or any of that or any of that. And we're going to call it this. Sign in, and we're going to call this sign up. The other thing that I always do when setting up an authentication system, regardless of actually whether or not I'm using OAuth at all, is I'd like to have two different layouts, and I call the standard layout application layout. Then I create what I call the authentication layout. And this is the layout that I use for publicly accessible routes. And then I use the application layout for authenticated routes. Because typically in that layout, I will have some sort of header that shows the current user and so forth and so on. And then what we can do is we can come here. We can say layout authentication. We can do it at the controller level. We might actually add stuff. We already talked about like the potential for having a sessions index route, which would be a authenticated route. So the other thing you can do is just say render layout authentication. I like to keep things a bit more scoped. So let's just do I think I have a project from work running on 3000. Let's come here, localhost 3001. Just do sessions new, sign in. There we go. And just for a sanity check, we will put a hello world. Right. So we are using that layout, authentication layout. Nice. Let's create a new tab here so we can work with Git. Git add app, leave the routes out. We want to use a separate authentication layout for the publicly accessible for use. Okay, so this gets enough of the infrastructure in place to like actually start building our OAuth flow, right? And let's focus on sessions new for now. So what are we going to need? Well, we're going to need, let's start off with just getting our controller up and running. So we're going to need a new controller. I'm just going to call it provider authorizations. And we only need create and show. So we run that and get rid of this. Get rid of that. So come in here, gives us our file. Nice. I kind of like these comments. Let's throw some in. Provider authorizations. This is just personal preference. So we have our controller that is connected to our routes. We can do a quick sanity check on that. Use the G helper. This is, grep provider. So our routes are pointing to our controller. Yep. Looks modeled up nicely. How would we hit this action from new? Right, so let's just get that wired up. This is a perfect use case for the button 2 helper. Button 2 helper is going to create a form, and inside of that form is a submit button. So you get proper like HTTP and HTML semantics to post to an endpoint. It's very nice. We are hitting this path. And let's see what default text it puts there. Let's put in some text. So sign in with provider. Okay, I got these arguments backwards. So this is now, just to inspect, right? We've got this form with class button 2, method post, action, provider, authorizations. And I just remembered that comment is wrong. And inside of that form, we've got our authenticity token, right? So Rails is going to give us that CSRF protection for free. And we've got our button type submit with our text, sign in with provider. So if we come over here and we look at our logs and we hit this, started post to provider authorizations, processing by provider authorizations controller create. Right? So wired up just the way we want. And this is perfect. So now we really do have all of the foundations in place to actually start building our OAuth integration. And in order to do that, we're going to need a third-party provider. So this is where we turn and start thinking about what it would look like to build, what it would require to build a third-party provider, and how we can sort of fake that in our application. Just something really lean and simple, and it'll help us with local testing and various other things. So let's jump into it. What we need is we're going to need to handle a few different routes. And this is the kind of thing that you can go and read up a lot more on how it goes, what the authorization code grant looks like. This is auth 0, but there's lots of different things that you can get into. But the key thing you'll see, right, is that the first endpoint that a provider needs, and this is like where the whole thing starts, is the authorize route. Right? Authorize a user. And this is a good breakdown, right? So this step, so if you're building a third-party provider, right? If you're building Facebook and you want to set it up as an OAuth provider, you can do anything you want here, right? But typically it may include one or more of the following processes. This is pretty standard. Authenticating the user. This is very, very common. Redirecting the user to an identity provider to handle authentication, right? So if you are building a service and an application and you use Okta or Auth 0, for example, and that service you are making available as a third-party provider via OAuth, they go to application, from application they go to service, from service they go to identity provider authenticates, sends them back to service. Now authentication is done, service handles authorization, then sends them back to application. You see that happens. Check for any active single sign-on sessions, right? You can make that user flow as simple or as complicated as tedious or not as you want. Obtaining user consent for the requested permission level, right? Unless consent has already been given. This is like why this is called authorization. You, as a user, you authorize the application that sent you here to have access to the scopes that it has requested. And of course, you can use whatever route you want, but the common endpoint here is authorize. So if we want to build a little simple OAuth provider, we're going to need to respond to the authorize endpoint. We'll get into all these parameters as we go. When you are the provider, how do you respond to the authorize endpoint? You respond with a redirect. So you send them back to the application and you include the authorization code. When the application has the authorization code and they want to exchange it for tokens, the provider needs to provide an endpoint for that. That is commonly put under OAuth token. And then as an application, you can make an API call. So we want to build a little provider that responds to these two endpoints, authorize and OAuth token, and allows us to demo this full flow and interaction. It also gives us control to change different things so that we can start to explore the edges of how these flows can change and evolve, and how that can affect what we might want to do with our application. I've got some uncommitted code. Let me start there. Git add all, git commit. So what I like to do, I guess I've only done it once. What I have done is to set up a little rack app inside of lib, and we are going to plug that in to our routes. So I'm gonna, I guess let's call this OAuth provider. We're gonna have an OAuth provider. Well, okay. This reminds me, inflections. Let me tell our Rails app about OAuth. We're going to have a little OAuth provider. And this OAuth provider is going to need, I think we might eventually, we'll see how we build it. All right, I'm just going to do request nil. And then let's just set up our OAuth app. So this is the code I have written previously. It's not going to look exactly like this, so we're going to do, this is going to say just provider. I honestly don't even remember what those are, so I remember what user info is, but I don't remember this one. And this is just token. Let's rename this to OAuth token. So we sort of have our own little internal routing. We can set up these methods, authorize, and OAuth token. And we can then put this into our Rails application. So we can say, we've got an OAuth provider. And then down here, hey, look at that. That's actually a useful copilot. So what we can do is we can set up a generic matcher that we just want it on provider here. Matches any route under the provider namespace where we have some sort of phase. This is language borrowed from OmniAuth for describing the sort of the different, phases, stages, steps of the overall flow. And so when we're looking here, you have these different requests, and OmniAuth sort of conceives of this whole flow as taking part across a number of phases, which they give distinct names to and sort of set stuff up. We can pass all of those requests to our rack app, right? We can handle all different kinds of HTTP verbs. The one key note here is that I initialize it outside of our routes draw block because we are going to want to retain some state. So our authorize here eventually is going to display a sign-in form, right? Just like this, a sign-in form. And we're going to want our provider to keep track of the values submitted in that form, such that later in the process, we can retrieve those values and pass them back to the application. And in order to be stateful in that way, we want to initialize it once for our application instance. And then when we go to the authorized endpoint and we show that form, and then that form gets submitted, oh, right, this is where authorized comes from. That's going to be the endpoint that we receive the form submission from. We're going to take that data, store that data just as instance variables. And when the application then asks for a token, we can use that information. Right? So we just want it to be stateful. And so having an instance, initializing that instance outside of this block makes that possible and makes that easy. So this is like the core scaffolding. I am going to go for, I don't know, 30 more minutes maybe. We'll see. Now we need to really start digging into the details. Right? What is the interaction between the application and our provider? And how do we build that and make that work? So let's try in the next 30 minutes to get this redirecting to the authorized endpoint. And let's have the authorized endpoint do something useful and make sure we're understanding the key elements there. So we know for sure we're going to need to redirect to an authorized URL, and it's going to be on another host. In this case, it's not on another host. We're doing everything inside of our own little app, but in production, you're going to be going to facebook.com, not yourapplication.com. Fix this typo. So at the very core of what this control action is doing, it just redirects. But as I said previously, it's going to need to redirect to a particular URL with some particular information. So let's learn a little bit, or most all of it, what that is. So there are a handful plus of different query parameters that you need to supply when you redirect to the authorized endpoint. The first one is just the response type. This is how you tell the third-party provider which of these different flows you are going down. Right? What type of, to use language here, which type are you using? So when you want to do the authorization code flow, you see here, authorization code flow, you have response type code. Then the way that OAuth works is that you have to, as an application, pre-register with the third-party OAuth provider to say, hi, I'm an application. I'm going to want to do OAuth with you. And at the end of that registration, you are going to get a client ID and a client secret. And those are essential for your interactions with that third-party provider. So it's the equivalent of like a username and password. but for server-to-server communication as a part of the OAuth flow. And you are always going to need to be passing your client ID. And that's just telling the third-party provider, hi, remember me, I'm OAuth demo application. I registered with you before. You know who I am. And it allows for a collection of security measures that we will see. Obviously, though, the most basic one is that you want to, as a third-party OAuth provider, right, where you're providing access to users' data that they have stored with you, security is going to be a major concern. So one thing you want to, like, definitionally, right, like you want to have only an allow list of applications that can even talk to you. This gives you some important degree of control and security. Right? So that's why we have pre-registration. That's why you have that client ID. And as a part of the flow, as a provider, you're going to want to check, do I know this client ID? The other thing you as an application need to provide is the redirect URI, right? So when the user is done with the provider, where does the provider send them back to in your application? And what is very, very common is that these third-party providers also enforce an allow list on the redirect URI. So when you register and you get your client ID, as a part of registration, you pre-tell the provider, these are all of the possible redirect URIs that I might use. And then when you specify a particular redirect URI for a particular authorization flow, that has to be in the allow list that you already registered. And this also just narrows the range of possibilities, which makes it possible to have higher security. You also need to specify the scope, right? So as we mentioned before, scopes are the encoding of the permissions that you want as an application. So what kind of actions do you want permission to be able to take on the user's data that lives in that third-party provider? Do you want to be able to read their email address? Do you want to be able to create repositories? Do you want to be able to read their list of repositories? So forth and so on. For any of like the third-party providers, GitHub, OAuth, scopes, there's going to be documentation where they tell you, here's how we encode this information. So you've got all of these different scopes of different degrees of granularity. And so you can say, oh, I want to be able to write to something or read from something, or just like give me both, or it lays it all out. And you can have a collection of them, right? I want to be able to write the repo hook and also read the org. And they describe how to pass many of them, right? In this case, it's a comma-separated list. So you go and read the documentation. Nope. For how you encode the permissions that you want. Audience is a non-traditional one. I have not personally seen it. GitHub doesn't use it. So I'm ignoring that one for now. State is the final one, and state is there. This is another security mechanism. And this is conceptually, this is the same as the authenticity token that Rails injects into forms to drive CSRF protection. You generate a state string, and that gets passed between the application and the provider as you go through the flow, just as a signature to make sure that things haven't been tampered with in between. So if we go and we read their description here, this is just an opaque, arbitrary alphanumeric string that your application adds to the initial request that auth0, or whatever the provider is, will include when redirecting back to your application, right? So it's the exact same. It's all about cross-site request forgery prevention, right? It's an authenticity token for a server-to-server communication like this. So let me just use this quick copy. What we want, is to set up our authorized URL like this with all of the correct query parameters. So as for how we do that, let's just have that in here. Yeah, not too bad. So we can hard code this for the time being. So we want a URI. Yeah, that's nice. And then let's just set this up. Then we want to add a query to it, and using rack utils is a nice way to make sure it's all formatted properly. And then, don't mind my dogs. We want to cast it to a string because redirect to does not work with URIs. And we are off to the races. So what's the stuff we're going to need? We're going to need the response type, the client ID, the redirect URI, the scope. We don't need audience. We need the state. Okay. Now, this is all sort of like hard-coded. I want to, though, demonstrate some of the tactics and procedures that I use in production, even though we're doing this like fully in like development mode. So client ID, definitely don't want to have just a string hanging out here in your Git repository. This is a perfect use case for credentials. And Copilot doesn't know that you can use dot syntax all the way through. I like to set up a namespace for the provider and then just set up the different values. So let's just do this in Vim. We could do Vim Rails, credentials edit. So we can set up our provider namespace. We can set up our client ID. This is some super, actually, this is not, this is a public identifier for our application for the provider. We have the client secret, and this is, as the name suggests, a super secret value that you should not expose. That's enough for now. So we can store these in credentials and pull them back out. For the redirect URI, we want this to be our show route, right? So instead of hard coding this, let's use some Rails magic. We can use the URL4 helper method, and from that we can just specify that we're in this controller. So if we say that we want to point to, oh, look at that. If we want to point to the show action and we want a full URL, right? So not just a path, but a full URL. We set only path to false. Then for our scope, this you can do in a couple of different ways. You could leave it as a string here. That's a little bit of a magic string. Don't love it. So one thing you could do, you could set up a constant up here and reference that. Or you could also move this into credentials. There's nothing secret about it, so it's not about securing it. It's just whichever of these feels more appropriate to you and your team for a way to make it clear. These are the scopes that we are asking for this provider. Let's just use the constant for now. And then for our state, we can just generate a secure random hex, but that doesn't quite work for us, right? Because if we recall, the thing that we're going to need, let's just go ahead and add this here, like we are going to verify state, let's call it. We need a way to take the value that we create and pass here to verify when it comes back that it is correct. And obviously, if we just put this here, we haven't stored it anywhere. If we put it in an instance variable, it becomes a bit susceptible, right? If you're like running your application in a more like distributed fashion. Actually, I think I saw this in Brad's code. Validate state token. Yeah. So I think this is spot on the way to do this. This, as we said, conceptually is a authenticity token. So we should use Rails's built-in support for CSRF protection through authenticity tokens. So there is a helper method to get one. Easy. And then we can define this verify state method. Just go and grab this. This is good stuff. So it's going to be sent back to us as a param under state. And again, this is a Rails method. So we can just ask, is this a valid authenticity token for this particular session and this particular state token? If not, we can raise the standard Rails error for invalid authenticity token. Like nothing. So this is all like leaning on Rails. So if we come here, I just want to have this inspected for us. Let's make these very clear here. So if we come here, I might need to restart this because we put something into lib. No route matches show. What did I do in routes? Did I mess this up? Provider authorizations, create show. This is a bit surprising. Let's see, bin Rails routes for provider. provider authorizations show. Do I have some sort of like typo going on here? Wait. Don't want two of these. What is wrong? I'm genuinely confused at this error. Talk to me in the chat if you got some ideas. Let's see. Like I have the controller name matches, the action name matches, our routes say we have that. Okay, well, let's be a little bit less indirect. Okay, whatever. Say provider authorization URL. Let's give that a go. No need to be generic here. This is a better error. Missing required keys. ID. Right. Right. How should we manage this? I don't really want to call it an index route because it's not that. But how do I say I don't care about the ID? I need to think about that a little bit more. But let's come back to this. I'll think about that, and I'll make a plan for the next stream tomorrow. But let's just look at our URL that we have built. So we have got our full URL hitting provider authorize. We're response type code. Our client ID we have pulled from Rails credentials. Our redirect URI is encoded, but localhost 3001 provider authorizations, ignore me. Our scope also encoded, OpenID profile email, and we have set a state parameter here. So here we now need to actually do something with this, right? We have pulled it up. So what we want to do Yeah, this looks pretty good. Let's set that up. We want to respond. Not that. Yeah, like that. All right, okay, wait, I guess it was right. It needs to be an array. So we can just build a little form here. So this needs to get cleaned up. I don't know why Copilot sort of like died here in the middle, but we can set up a basic little form which can hit an endpoint here for the provider. We can set up some styling here, just put everything, display flex direction column. This is coming from some old code I've written. I don't know why Copilot stopped in the middle. Width fit content, margin 1 rem auto, text aligned left, gapped 1. Okay. Then let's pull this out. So we want to keep track of the state. So we're going to have a value, and this value we want to pull out of our request params state that we received. We also want to keep track of the callback URL so that we know what to do with that. And that's going to be the same thing. No, sorry. It's called redirect URI. Those are just some hidden inputs, pass stuff back up. Then label for name, yeah, input type text ID name, yeah, email. So this is like a really simple thing. This is not like username and password. This is just give me some information about yourself. Button type submit, which we can keep track of. Right? In this case, we're not actually authenticating. Everyone will get authenticated. So we're going to want to keep track of these things. So build up some HTML, a little basic form, and respond with it. I'm definitely going to need to restart my server here, and don't need that debugging anymore. HTTP parse error, malformed request, invalid HTTP format, parsing fails. Are you trying to open an SSL connection? I am in here. Yeah, Copilot does not know I'm on localhost at first. Whoopsie. So we have now connected our application with the provider. Now, it happens to be that we're on the same host, but this is a completely different rack application. So the last thing we need here, I just want to build this little authorized endpoint quickly to store these values. Let's see what Copilot gives us. Name and email, request programs, name and email. Yes, that looked right. And then our callback URL, we want to get as a URI, and we want to build a query where we pass back the state. Yep. And then we want to provide, let's call this authorization code. And just to add some uniqueness, let's shrink that down. And then we just need to respond. Yeah, 302 location. Lovely. And we verify state, and we can just check. Do we get in? So yeah, I need to reset this because we made changes in this lib file. Not going to get picked up. But if we go Stephen, and I'm just going to use some fake email address, and I submit, we will see that we're in here. Awesome. And we can see this route, right? So we have our state back, and we have our authorization code. We verified the state correctly, right? So all of the Rails stuff passed. We have a valid authenticity token. Awesome. And then we rendered the show page. So this is very lean, right? Very basic. There's not a lot of like fanciness here, but we have like built the full end-to-end flow of the core of OAuth, right? We start on our application. Our application provides a button to post, so some endpoint in our app. That endpoint redirects to the third-party provider, passing along some essential information. The third-party provider authenticates the users, shows them some sort of form, gets the response of that form, validates it. I mean, we can add a lot more code here. We can make this third-party provider like much more realistic. And over time, we're going to do that. We're going to add some different error states where things can go wrong and learn how we can deal with them. But for now, right, keep it simple. Third-party provider eventually redirects back to our application, to the location specified in the redirect URI. And we can ensure that there has not been a cross-site forgery attack taking place. We verified the state, and then we can do what we need. And we will cover that in the next one. So like we come back here with our authorization code. And now we can talk about the next steps, like how we turn the authorization code into a access code and how we can use that access code. We can start to build that out. We can also start exploring some of the edge cases, some of the other error modes and variations on the flow. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of the week, is dig into the details. But there you go. I mean, we've been here an hour and a half, and we have the core of the OAuth flow built, both sides. And it's not a lot of code. And this is the core thing I really wanted to get across, is that this isn't really as intimidating as all of the jargon, all of the overly complicated, in my opinion, documentation makes it seem. If you take the time, sit with it and dig through it and experiment with it, build these things up, you come to see it's quite reasonable. The flow makes sense. The different elements and how they fit together make sense. It's quite intuitive once you start to get the core concepts in your head. And building it into a Rails application is not odd or complicated or a crazy decision to make. And in fact, I think it really is very helpful to an application, because if you ensure that all of your developers feel comfortable and confident with this code, and they also have a natural sense of ownership, right? It's so easy when the code lives in an open source repository, it's so easy for the team to be like, well, that's their responsibility. And something broke, throw up my hands. I don't know that code. I didn't write that code. I've never read that code. How can I be responsible for that code? When you've got business critical integrations, you want to make sure that every developer in your team naturally understands that there's a clear signal just by the way in which the code is written and where that code is written, that they are responsible for that code. And there's an expectation that they are to understand what that code is doing. When that code lives in the application, lives in the repository itself, that is a very clear signal of where the responsibility lies and what the expectations are. And when you write it with a mind towards following Rails conventions, following RESTful conventions, it really can be quite straightforward to follow. So I'm really looking forward to running through a few more sessions with everyone over the coming days. Let me finish this up by committing what we have. And then after this, I'm going to make the GitHub repository and I'll share that. But yeah, hour and a half. Look at how much we've gotten through. Look at how much we understand. This doesn't need to be intimidating. So let's do git add app config lib. Let's commit. We set up the authorization phase with both a client and a provider. Perfect. So there we go. Close this stuff up. I will tweet out tomorrow as I get a clearer sense of my plans, but in all likelihood, I'll go live again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Thanks for hanging out, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in the chat tomorrow. And I will get the chat right on the first setup this time. I won't have to set up 3 different streams just to have chat. Ooh, stop sharing. All right. Talk to everyone then. Bye.